we are is determined by a complex interaction between the genetic instructions we inherit at conception and the environmental factors that influence how those instructions are expressed. The dance that goes on within each of us between heredity and environment, between the forces of nature and nurture, is a constant interaction and determines who grows tall and who stays thin, who is outgoing and who is shy. This interaction, which begins in the womb and continues throughout the lifespan, is an intricate and fundamental dance of life. The forces of nature, what we call heredity, and the outside influences of the environment interact over time to make us who we are. The better we understand these forces, the better we will be able to understand human development.
When we talk about heredity, we're talking about transmission of propensities, predispositions, likelihoods from parent to child through the genes. Now, the gene-behavior relationship is not a direct one, it's an indirect one. And the way the child will ultimately turn out is a matter of probability. It may take certain environments to bring out certain traits. When we talk about the environment, we're talking about influences that are not passed down through the genes. The more that we study families and twins and adoptees, we're learning that the environments that surround us are not just there by chance, that we as active people in our environments partially create those environments.
I mean, environment is a major player, I think, in most of the things that we're talking about now. Everything from heart disease to cancers to behavioral disorders. And for all of those disorders, while genetics plays a role, environment plays a role as well. The whole basis of genetics, bad science fiction movies notwithstanding, is people always reproduce and have people, and dogs always have dogs, and some information must be stored to be able to do that.
All human cells contain the fundamental components of heredity. A gene is the basic unit of genetic instruction and is one part of a chromosome, which in turn is a molecule of deoxyribonucleic acid, or DNA. DNA contains the basic code that directs human development. With the exception of sperm and ovum, every normal human cell contains 23 pairs of chromosomes, or a total of 46.
Each parent contributes 23 chromosomes, and then when the sperm penetrates the egg, that restores the number of chromosomes to the normal human number of 46. So each parent contributes exactly half of the child's genetic makeup. But then one has to realize that there can be interaction among genes and chromosomes. And so a child is not an exact replica of his mother or father, but perhaps is a function of their genes acting in combination. He may resemble the mother or father in certain sorts of ways, but the child is unique.
And so each time a human being or any other mammal reproduces, some of that DNA gets scrambled around a little bit. So while you've inherited the genes from your mother and father, none of the chromosomes are in exactly the same order. While your kids share many of the same traits that you and your wife have that are genetic, at least in nature, they're also uniquely their own individuals.
Since chromosome pairs divide during the formation of sperm and ovum, chance alone determines which of each pair will wind up in one and which in the other. According to the laws of probability, A given mother and father can form more than 64 trillion genetically distinct offspring, all brothers and sisters, but each one different from the others. It's ironic, then, that we learn more about this diversity by studying identical twins, whose genes are exact copies of one another.
We had people stare at us like little kids, and they were confused if, they're seeing double. And
one way to look at the interplay between heredity and the environment is to use twin studies in which experts compare the similarity between identical twins and fraternal twins. In some pregnancies, the zygote that forms when the sperm and ovum unite splits apart and creates two identical clusters of cells. Those clusters become monozygotic twins. In other words, twins originating from one zygote.
Monozygotic twins are really identical twins, but we prefer the term monozygotic or MZ because even monozygotic twins who share all their genes are not exactly the same. There are differences in physical development and in behavioral development that we need to be sensitive to. Identical twins are more alike than any other pair of relatives, and they show a very high degree of resemblance in intelligence, in physical development, in personality. But some traits drop off a little bit. For example, personality shows less resemblance than intelligence, and job satisfaction less than personality. Probably the most highly genetically influenced traits are brain waves and height. Those show very, very strong genetic influence. But even there, it's not 100% perfect, which means the environment really does affect virtually every aspect of human development. Now, the fraternal or dizygotic twins, what we call DZ, result when two separate eggs are released by the mother and separately fertilized by sperm from the father. So while these twins had the same birthday and shared the womb with one another, they are no more alike genetically than ordinary siblings born 5, 10, even 15 years apart.
Comparing monozygotic and dizygotic twins enables researchers to distinguish between the impact of genetic and environmental factors on both physical and psychological characteristics.
Twin studies are a very simple but very elegant design that allow us to really dissect human behavior and to try to figure out how much of the different traits, intelligence, personality, height, weight, are linked to genetic differences among us, and how much of the variation between us in those traits is linked to the environmental differences between us. And you compare the similarity between genetically identical twins and the genetically non-identical or fraternal twins. If the identical twins are more alike in that trait than fraternals, this is consistent with the genetic influence on that behavior.
Ali and Mohammed are identical twins that Dr. Siegel has observed over the years. She has known the twins ever since they first enrolled in her psychology class.
The class was full, and I wanted to enroll in the class too. So what happened was that Ali went to Dr. Siegel's office one day and said, my brother wants to enroll in your class. Is there a possibility that he could enroll? I know the class is full. And she just, out of the blues, said, unless you have a twin brother, that's the only reason I would let you in the class, but the class is full. And Ali said, well, I have a twin brother. If that would get him in, I have a twin brother. And Dr. Nancy Siegel just was surprised and said, are you kidding me? Is that true? And he said, yes. So she said, okay, well, just meet me the next day at her office to prove to her that we're twins. So anyways, the next day we showed up together, and, luckily she was so happy, and she said, of course, I want both of you in my class.
I used to be able to tell them apart without any trouble because Ali was always a little bit leaner than Mohammed. But lately they've been changing a bit, and it's getting really, really difficult to tell them apart sometimes. I'm aware of differences between them. I have to say that I'm more overwhelmed by the similarity, that each seems to be a version of the same thing. And that's a feeling that one gets with many, many identical twins. And I think it's something the twins really enjoy themselves.
It's fun because obviously you always have a friend, a partner, a brother. It's fun because we always do things together. Now it's even fun being a twin because we could relate to each other a lot better than we were, when we were younger. I could see my personality in him, and he could see his personality in me. Well, yes, I mean, we're going our different ways. We still go out together, and we will still have our same friends, but we might go into maybe different fields. We're still shaky on that. But I mean, if we could still be in the same field, it would be great. We could help each other out in the future.
Like most siblings, Ali and Mohammed have developed separate interests and goals in life, even though they share the same genetic makeup. Dawn and Dave McGill, on the other hand, are monozygotic twins who have stayed with each other throughout most of their lives, both in occupation and interests, offering their students and colleagues the chance to observe a truly fascinating twin team.
There is an easiness about them with each other. They are so comfortable with each other. And they enjoy their twinship a great deal and actually use it in ways that they both benefit. I was struck by the fact that the McGills talked about three identities: the identity of one twin, the identity of the other, and what they share. And they said that they always try to preserve that. They value it. They realize that it's something precious.
We have our two individual personalities, then we have that twin thing. And the twin thing blurs the individuals to a certain extent, but it's much more powerful because people seem to see it as a single entity. So they think that we do a lot more than we do, I think. And how do you do all that stuff? Well, there's actually two people feeding a single person's definition.
For example, they team teach a class. And so one is responsible for the online component and one makes other decisions. They don't have to make all the decisions themselves. They can leave it to the brother comfortably. So there's a sort of level of trust there and ease that allows this collaboration to flow quite freely. And I think it's true of many twins that they have a sense of their capabilities. If I can do it, you can too. And that implicit trust, I think, is something that only twins really, really enjoy.
That team is something that we have developed just because twins are allowed to early. We've always been together. So we have probably a rule set that is very complex, that we don't even understand it. Although Dave and I have talked about it to a huge degree, more than most of the twins we know. But when it comes to most people's relationships, they're still bouncing off one another, and they don't know how to go inside a place where they can have these big, huge words like trust. That type of teaming is a natural kind of consequence, I think, of a long-term kind of commitment to, it's not going to fall apart when you have your first fight. And well, we couldn't get away from one another. We were brothers. And we can't divorce. We can't, and we could have, I guess, by the time we got old enough to get our own jobs, but by that time we'd sort of learned how to. There was an advantage to playing his skill. There are things I didn't have to do because I had two people doing what normally one person does. So it looks like we do a great job. But if it were just me, it probably wouldn't look so impressive.
Now, I think that any university department would be very smart to take a pair of identical twins. And I say that because these twins can collaborate so well. I think that their productivity together would be higher than just two unrelated people.
You don't have very many visual artists that team on a sculpture. You take care of the arms, I'll do the legs. It's just not going to happen, You're going to have an artist and you're going to have an apprentice. Right. And that's the difference is in a twinning type team, it is lateral. It's really lateral. Now that doesn't mean that we don't take on tasks where he'll take the leadership or I'll take the leadership. Depends on whether we have either some knowledge that's more expert in one way or the other and that person takes the lead. But in some places it's like flip a coin and says, here, you do this and I'll do this. And on Tuesday, let's get together and put it together.
I got somebody in our fire department that looks exactly like you. You have a twin brother. And I went to Jimmy and says, how the hell should I know? I'm adopted.
In most instances, twins grow up sharing the same experience, but in rare cases, twins are raised in different families, never knowing who or where their sibling resides.
The best nature-nurture study I've ever been associated with is the Minnesota study of twins raised apart. And what we did here was to gather cases of twins who were separated as infants and reunited as adults.
One set of twins that took part in the Minnesota study is known as the Fireman twins. The two men met after 31 years of not knowing they even had a twin brother.
Mark Newman and Jerry Levy were separated at birth and adopted by separate families in New Jersey, and grew up apart a number of miles away from each other. When I met them, they had just met. They're 6'4", thick mustaches, big guys. They have a long, long list of similarities. When we had them in the lab over that entire week, they used to play with each other and horse around as if they'd been doing it for years. And I think it's because their behavioral styles, their information processing, their understanding of the way the world works was just perfectly matched. And they will tell you that they're one. They've said it many times, we are one, but we're different.
Research like the Minnesota twin study suggests that our genetic makeup influences nearly every biological, cognitive, and psychosocial aspect of our development. But these studies also confirm that environmental factors continually shape these personal traits throughout our lifespan.
Those trees, all of them. I should give you that chore and start painting it every week.
No, I want to pick up blue.
The factors that influence human development are the product of an ongoing interaction between heredity and the environment. To understand how genes influence human development, it is important to differentiate a person's genetic potential and the actual expression of that inheritance. In other words, the difference between a person's genotype and his or her phenotype. A genotype is a person's underlying genetic inheritance. In other words, all the genetic instructions locked in an individual's DNA. The phenotype, however, is the outward expression of the genotype and is all the physical, behavioral, and other genetic characteristics that are actually expressed.
So while the genotype might refer to the genes at the molecular level, the phenotype would be the brown eyes, the brown hair, the height, the weight, the IQ, the personality. Anything I can see, observe, or measure is the phenotype.
Whether or not a genetic trait is expressed in the phenotype is determined by two factors: the ongoing interaction between genes and the environment, and the interaction among genes themselves. For example, the interplay between dominant and recessive genes.
Remember, we have two copies of all of our genes. One we got from mom, the other we got from dad. A dominant gene is one in which the change in even one of those copies will result in the phenotype that we're interested in looking at. Doesn't matter whether you got it from mom or dad, just have one copy that's altering things. A recessive gene requires you to actually have two copies, one from mom and from dad, before the phenotype is actually observed.
We can see how the interaction between dominant and recessive genes works by following the genes of brown-eyed and blue-eyed parents. The two large B's represent the dominant brown eyes gene. The two small b's, the recessive blue eyes gene. When a child is conceived, the parent's genes separate and recombine, so each parent contributes 1/2 of each child's genes. For this family, brown eyes will prevail in all children, even when the blue eyes gene is present. But this doesn't mean blue eyes are headed for extinction. Watch what happens when brown-eyed children carrying blue eyes genes later become parents. The recessive trait now has the chance to reappear as the genes separate into 4 possible combinations in their children. Chances are that 3 of the children will have a dominant gene that will lead to brown eyes. Only 1 in 4 will have both of the recessive blue eyes genes, and thus will have blue eyes.
Studies about whether a gene is dominant or recessive or how it acts actually come from pedigree studies, which is just a fancy way of saying we looked at a lot of different family members, hopefully in multiple generations, and we can actually trace the pattern of that gene.
While the interaction between dominant and recessive genes is one factor that determines whether or not a particular trait is expressed in an individual's phenotype, another factor is the interaction between genes and the environment. For example, consider modern medicine and medical intervention as the critical environmental factors in the detection and treatment of the genetic disorder, PKU.
If the person who has the PKU gene has a metabolic defect in the brain, so there is an accumulation of phenylalanine, and this will lead to mental retardation. Now, if this is detected early on, and all newborns are screened for PKU, and the person is given a phenylalanine-free diet from birth through adolescence, this will mostly offset the effect of mental retardation. So genotypes and environments both work to affect behavior, and two people with the same genotype might not have the same phenotype. If we think about Ali and Mohammed, for example, if we talk about any difference between them, it's got to be something environmental. We see the same genotype, but maybe something in their environment is causing a different phenotype.
While the role of the environment in the expression of physical traits is fairly simple to understand, more difficult to identify and comprehend are gene-environment interactions. In some cases, there is still debate about whether a particular trait is either genetic or environmental.
The truth, like most things in life, is somewhere in between. It's almost a silly argument to talk about whether or not something is 100% genetic or 100% environmental, because most things are both.
The complex interaction between genes and the environment influences human development at every age. So while genes may be the first chapter in a particular story, it is important to recognize the various external influences that shape an individual throughout his or her lifetime. In some instances, normal human development is disrupted by one or more genetic or chromosomal abnormalities. Understanding such abnormalities provides an appreciation of the complexities of genetic interactions and an opportunity to lessen their consequences.
We now understand that many of the genes that you inherit predispose you to things like cancer, behavioral disorders. You can imagine that this is sort of like a little ticking time bomb in your DNA, and finding that time bomb is the first step in going in and being able to defuse it.
That genetic time bomb was inside Andrew Gobia when he was born with severe combined immune deficiency, or SCID. Andrew came into this world with an immune system so weak that influenza, pneumonia, or even a common cold could end his life.
Andrew's sister also had the same immune deficiency that he had. She inherited the same two defective genes. The problem is the first child in a family with this disease often doesn't come to medical attention until they have a severe infection. And so that she didn't come to our hospital for a bone marrow transplant until she already had a pneumonia that proved to be fatal.
Because Andrew's parents had already lost one child to genetic illness, they were prime candidates for genetic counseling. In genetic counseling, a trained professional constructs a family history and charts patterns of health and sickness over generations. The counselor explains any specific conditions and associated risks, and, if necessary, recommends that the couple undergo genetic testing. This testing often leads to prenatal diagnosis, which involves one or more tests to determine if a fetus is developing well.
Prenatal diagnosis is when you're actually looking at the genes in your unborn child, and there are a variety of techniques that one can do this. Amniocentesis, where you literally can stick a needle in and pull out some of the fluid surrounding your unborn child. It's because unborn children slough off skin cells into the media just like we do, and so you can get a little bit of DNA and determine what the genetic information is.
Because doctors were aware that Andrew's sister was born with severe combined immune deficiency, they performed an amniocentesis on Andrew's mother.
By DNA analysis, we were able to determine that Andrew had, in fact, inherited two broken copies of the ADA gene. So that predicted that he would have this immune deficiency problem when he was born.
Genetic testing led doctors to conclude that young Andrew needed gene therapy to survive. Gene therapy is the process of adding normal genes to the body by way of blood transfusion, bone marrow transplant, or direct insertion into a particular cluster of cells. The body then replaces the ailing cells with healthy ones.
To be able to perform gene therapy for Andrew, we needed to have the gene that he was missing, have a normal copy of that, and have a way of getting it into his body. And the normal gene that he was missing, ADA, had been cloned many years ago and was available in a virus or vector that could carry it into his cells.
Doctors successfully transferred the gene Andrew was missing into his body, and in the process, gave the boy a new lease on life.
What we find from looking at Andrew's blood samples is that he's continuing to make new white blood cells that have the gene that we put into his cord blood cells shortly after birth. And so we know that there's at least some degree of permanence of the stem cells that took up the gene, so that even now he continues to make new blood cells every day.
Today, Andrew lives a happy and healthy life. Challenged by his genetic makeup, Andrew was helped from the environment into which he was born. Thanks to nurturing parents, caring doctors, and state-of-the-art gene therapy, his immune system now functions as it should. In many ways, Andrew's story and the study of twins, while vastly different, provide living proof that both our genetic makeup and the environment in which we live influence us from the day we're conceived. Their stories teach us that how we develop isn't the result of nature or nurture. Instead, it's the ongoing dance between nature and nurture.